says physics professor Stephen Block.
The energy in a fully laden 767 is nearly equal to a kiloton of TNT being exploded. The energy in a fully laden 767 is nearly equal to a kiloton of TNT being exploded. This is a staggering amount of energy, and it's equivalent, roughly speaking, to about a 20th of the energy that was deposited in the bomb that leveled Hiroshima.
But still, the towers stood. The blazing jet fuel, however, created fires burning hot enough to weaken the steel that held the World Trade Center high. Wasn't the shaking? It was fire.
It was definitely the fire that took the building down.
As the fire burned on, experts say, temperatures rose above 1,000 degrees to the point where steel loses its strength.
Once it began to fail, it dragged in the floors and proceeded to pancake floor by floor so that the entire building collapsed, which was not necessary.
My question, did you know how vulnerable the building was?
Well, first of all, there's a couple of points. One, to put it in perspective, the engineering work was done about 35 years ago.
So you're not old enough to have designed that building.
I was in the 6th grade when the engineering work was done.
But you were a very precocious 6th grader, obviously.
Actually, it's interesting. It's interesting because the World Trade Center towers and what they represented was one of the reasons that I went into structural engineering. My partner, Ron Klemenzik, and I, we have fielded over 60 interviews about the World Trade Center, and the question hasn't been right yet. The question has always been, why did the buildings fall down? And in fact, the question should have been, why did they stand up?
Well, let me get to that. I'm sorry, let me get to that, and I know you want to answer that. But what is so amazing to me, and maybe we get at this issue by doing it this way, what is amazing to me is how orderly was the collapse of the building. Now, when you look at the World Trade Center as it existed before we lost it, what strikes you always when you look at it is the incredible power of the vertical lines in that building, the magnificent vertical pieces of steel that went up. And what strikes me is how well they held, because the building really fell when it went and could not withstand the kind of heat that it did. It really fell right within the parameters of those vertical pieces of steel.
Well, that's exactly right. And the interesting point is, and what a lot of these emails were saying, is that basically 99% of the buildings in our country would have fallen immediately if they had been hit by a 767. And this building was able to stand, both towers actually were able to stand for about an hour after a direct hit. And I mean, this was engineering work done long before I was an engineer.
Why did it happen?
Well, both of the towers actually survived the initial impact from the airplanes, and they stood for about an hour. It was only when they finally were consumed by the fire from the jet fuel that they did collapse.
Let me make sure I understand what you're saying. It wasn't the impact of the aircrafts on the structure of the building that caused them to collapse. It was the subsequent events, mostly the aviation fuel that exploded? That's right. The structure was able to survive for at least another hour after the actual impact. When structural steel gets up to about 1,500 to 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, it loses its strength. It loses its ability to carry load. Fascinating. When I was much younger, this is in the 1940s, I think, a plane rammed the Empire State Building. I don't know whether you recall that or not. Yes. You being much younger, you must know about it. But the Empire State Building seemed to absorb that airplane crash, fuel and all. Help us understand the difference. Right. We're talking about a significant difference in the quantity of the fuel that was on board. These were large, fully loaded jets. Back then, that was a much, much smaller jet. And both the buildings did survive the impact of the plane. And it was only this jet fuel fire that brought about the demise of the building. The Twin Towers, the World Trade Centers, that could not be destroyed by the impact of the aircraft, but could be destroyed and were destroyed by the fact that this aviation fuel got loose and just, in effect, melted the steel. Right.
The plane came through, it took out a few of the exterior columns of the building, and then set off this massive fire with the jet fuel. And fortunately, because of the perimeter tube system of the building, it was able to withstand the initial impact and allow a lot of people to get out.
1,600 degrees or even more, that melted the steel. As it melted the steel, shell or frame.
A double support system that withstood the crash, but not the raging jet fuel fire.
When the intense fire started, when these two large commercial aircraft went into these planes, caused such fire, aided by aviation fuel, so that the steel simply couldn't stand it, melted, collapsed on itself, and then simply collapsed floor by floor down to the bottom.
Office of Emergency Management, or 7 World Trade Center, was on the north side. The World Trade Center, the two towers sat in the middle.
That had been hijacked and their destinations were uncertain at that time. This is a live picture of Lower Manhattan, missing two of its most familiar profiles, obviously. The twin trade towers of the World Trade Center, iconic buildings here in New York, really representing, symbolic, if you will, of the enormous economic strength of this country. They sustained an attack in 1993. They were reopened. The country came back from that, and we went about our merry way again, thinking that in Fortress America this couldn't possibly happen. But of course it has. Neil Livingston is one of the most widely recognized experts on international terrorism. Mr. Livingston, we keep coming back to the same issue. This was a very sophisticated attack. This was not just a lone suicide bomber of some kind. 4 hijackings simultaneously.
The next probably couple of months, 2 months or so, this is the scene in Lower Manhattan. As we say, you're watching continuing CBS News coverage.
It's strange because my building, tower number 1, was the first to be struck. It was the second of the two to collapse. I had been out on the street not even a minute. I had made my way 1 block over to not so much the outside office areas of the side that I was on. And then we made our way to the stairwell and in a very orderly fashion made our way down 81 flights.
Was there a check? I mean, was it, you know, Fred, are you here? Bill, are you here? Mary, are you here?
Yes, but it was almost useless to really account for everybody not knowing what was going on, who could have been in the bathrooms. Luckily,
have a strong degree of probability that it's bin Laden, but I think you have to recognize that we are part of a world community, and we have to make sure that before we go out and do something, and I agree with you, if we get the persuasive evidence that we all believe is coming in, that we should have a proportionate response. But nevertheless, we also have to recognize that we have allies in the Middle East, we have allies in Europe. That we
Name one that would argue with our responding today without even asking them. Name one.
I think the Egyptians, I think the Saudi Arabians. But
the Saudi Arabians, whose riches depend on us, would be angry for us for
not put those rescue workers into danger themselves. So that is obviously the problem. We were told by a couple of people that were in there before rescue workers that there are bodies, a number of bodies lying around in the debris and on the street there. Obviously, part of the job will be to bring them out. We are also told by Port Authority officials that the building over there, which is building number 7, which you can see, that there is some concern on the part of Port Authority officials about the stability of that building at this point.
Capability for such a huge operation. Many world governments have ordered defense alerts and called emergency security meetings. In Moscow, President Vladimir Putin...
Through the day, an inferno raged in World Trade Center building number 7, another massive office tower. Firefighters feared that it would collapse.
Stand back, stay as close as you can where you're not in the way.
But for hours, they stood cut off from the rubble, feeling both fierce and helpless because they were not allowed into the rescue area. In the midst of a frustrating afternoon, evidence of why they had not been sent in. Number 7 World Trade Center collapsed.
You guys have been doing this to me all day. Let's just wait a couple minutes. It's not going to make... 7 was empty.
Okay, somebody might have been pulled out. Somebody else might have died, but at least we would have had a shot at pulling somebody out who just died.
We don't make those decisions.
Right.
Workers were moving cautiously toward the building.
You hear that?
Keep your eye on that building as they coming down.
Closer to the building, it was almost like nighttime. What was left of the building was a fiery hulk. The firefighters thought it might